Imagine a land of breathtaking diversity, ancient civilizations, and centuries of thriving kingdoms. Then picture it swept into one of the most transformative encounters in human history. This is the story of India under British rule, a period that reshaped every aspect of Indian life, culturally, politically, economically, and socially, and whose impacts still resonate today. British rule didn't arrive overnight. It grew from trade interests into political dominance, from alliances into annexations, and from commerce into an empire. When the British East India Company first landed on Indian shores, they came as traders. When they left, they had rewritten India's legal systems, education, infrastructure, and even its identity. To understand modern India, you must first understand this shared era, the paradox of colonization, how it brought railways and reforms, but also exploitation and resistance. This isn't just a chapter in textbooks. It's a story of transformation that affected hundreds of millions of lives. So let's trace the long road of British impact on India, from early encounters to a legacy that shapes the subcontinent to this day. Long before the British arrived, India was already one of the most vibrant and complex civilizations on Earth. Empires rose and fell, the Mauryas, Guptas, Cholas, each leaving rich legacies in art, language, religion, and governance. Cities like Pataliputra and later Delhi, Agra, and Lahore were hubs of administration, culture, and trade. India's economy was among the world's largest, exporting textiles, spices, and luxury goods to markets as far away as East Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Diverse religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and later Islam, coexisted and intermingled, shaping rich philosophical and cultural traditions. Social structures, including caste systems, governed everyday life and community relationships. With languages like Sanskrit, Tamil, Persian, and many regional dialects, India's identity was plural and fluid. Trade guilds, irrigation systems, universities, and cities flourished. Hindu, Muslim, and local rulers adapted and collaborated in a tapestry of exchange and innovation. India was not a weak land ripe for conquest. It was a dynamic world with its own long history. British arrival would not introduce civilization, but would collide with an existing mosaic, transforming it in ways both profound and painful. The story of British domination in India began not with guns, but with trade. In 1600, the British East India Company received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth, the first to trade in the East Indies. Soon, Indian spices, silk, and cotton textiles transformed British markets. But as competition hardened between European powers, especially the Dutch and the French, the company militarized its presence. Strategic trading posts at Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta became fortified centers of influence. Battles with the French East India Company and alliances with local rulers became common. A transformative moment came with the 1757 Battle of Plassey, where Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal with a mix of military strategy and native alliances. This victory gave the company revenue rights over Bengal, a massive economic prize. Suddenly, the East India Company was no longer just a trader. It became a political power with taxation authority, armies, and territories. Over time, the company annexed states, ruled provinces, and enforced laws, all driven by profit and political dominance. This shift from commerce to rule marked the beginning of British political control. setting the stage for a transformation of India's systems, livelihoods, and societies. Under British rule, India's economy ceased to function primarily for Indian prosperity and began serving British interests. The East India Company's control over taxation, land revenue, and trade redirected wealth away from Indian hands. Traditional industries, particularly textiles, were decimated. India had once been a global leader in cotton and silk production, exporting fine fabrics to Africa, Asia, and Europe. But British policies systematically dismantled these industries. Indian weavers faced taxes, tariffs, and competition from cheap machine-made British textiles, which flooded Indian markets. Land revenue systems like the zamindari system forced peasants to pay high taxes, often leading to debt and dispossession. Wealth flowed out of India to Britain, financing factories, infrastructure, and global expansion in the metropole. India's role shifted from producer of finished goods to supplier of raw materials and consumer of British industrial products. This reversal impoverished local economies and altered traditional life. Famines worsened as cash crops like indigo and opium replaced subsistence farming. India became integrated into a global economic order that privileged British capital and industry, deepening inequality and dependency. The economic transformation under British rule was profound. It enriched Britain at the expense of India's own prosperity and autonomy. One of the most far-reaching impacts of British rule was the transformation of land ownership and agricultural practices. Traditional systems of landholding, where communities held land collectively or under local custom, were replaced with rigid British-designed revenue systems, most notably the zamindari, ryotwari, and mahawari systems. Under zamindari, landlords became intermediaries for tax collection, often squeezing peasants for revenue owed to the colonial state. Many small farmers lost land due to high taxes or debt, forcing them into tenancy or wage labor. In the ryotwari system, individual peasants were directly assessed, making them personally responsible for cash payments, sometimes regardless of crop success. These policies transformed Indian agriculture from subsistence-based to cash-oriented, often destabilizing local food security. British officials underestimated local ecological knowledge and rhythms, leading to monoculture cash crops that were vulnerable to market fluctuations and climate risks. Combined with heavy taxation and lack of state support for irrigation or rural welfare, agricultural distress became common. Many rural families found themselves reliant on moneylenders or migrating to cities for work. This agricultural overhaul wasn't just economic. It reshaped rural society, altered social structures, and widened the gap between rich landlords and struggling cultivators. One of the most visible legacies of British rule is India's railway network. Built primarily to serve colonial interests, moving troops, facilitating cash crop exports, and integrating markets, the railways nonetheless became one of India's unifying infrastructures. Over 40,000 miles of track were laid by the early 20th century, connecting remote regions, ports, and cities. This connectivity accelerated trade, communication, and mobility in ways Indian history had never seen before. However, the railways were designed not for Indian self-development, but for colonial extraction, moving raw materials like cotton, coal, and opium toward ports for export and distributing British manufactured goods across India. Roads, canals, and telegraph lines followed similar patterns, strategic for control, not community development. While modern India benefits from this infrastructure, its origins were rooted in exploitation. Railways made the colonial economy more efficient, but also more extractive. Local artisans and small producers struggled to compete with imported British goods carried cheaply by rail. Yet this infrastructure inadvertently knitted India together culturally and economically, laying the groundwork for national movements and post-independence development. The railways embody a paradox, a colonial tool that later became a pillar of Indian unity and progress. British policies radically transformed education in India, introducing Western curricula, formal schools, and English as a language of learning. Prior to colonial influence, India had rich traditional systems of learning, gurukulas, madrasas, and centers of philosophy and science that taught in Sanskrit, Persian, or local languages. The British saw education as a way to create a class of intermediaries, Indians educated in English and British administrative methods who could support colonial governance. Visionaries like Thomas Babington Macaulay championed English education, arguing that it would produce a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions and morals, and in intellect. As a result, schools and colleges began teaching British literature, science, and law. English became the language of administration, higher education, and modern professions. While this marginalized many traditional learning systems, it also opened avenues for Indians to engage with global ideas, modern science, and political thought. Figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, B.R. Ambedkar, and many freedom fighters emerged from this English-educated class. The spread of English reshaped Indian identity, creating opportunities and complexities. It both facilitated colonial control and later empowered leaders who would demand independence. British rule introduced a new legal and judicial system in India, replacing a mosaic of local customs with codified colonial law. Traditional systems varied widely across regions and communities. Hindu law, Islamic jurisprudence, and tribal customs shaped justice locally. The British replaced this plurality with a unified legal framework based on British principles, establishing high courts, civil codes, and procedural law. Institutions like the Indian Penal Code, 1860, and the Code of Civil Procedure standardized legal processes across India. On one hand, these reforms brought clarity, documentation, and a semblance of impartiality that India had lacked in some regions. They helped suppress practices the British deemed unjust, such as infanticide, sati, and certain forms of bonded labor, often citing humanitarian motivations. On the other hand, the colonial judiciary became a tool of colonial authority, enforcing laws that prioritized British power and interests. Indians accused of rebellion, sedition, or resistance faced harsh colonial penalties, while British officials often enjoyed legal immunity. The courts also marginalized indigenous dispute resolution mechanisms and social norms, leaving communities disconnected from familiar systems of justice. The British legal legacy in India is complex. It introduced modern law and order, but it also reinforced unequal power structures and sidelined indigenous legal traditions. British rule coincided with increased Christian missionary activity, which brought English missionaries from Britain and Europe deep into Indian society. These missionaries built schools, hospitals, and churches, often in regions that lacked formal services. They translated the Bible into local languages and introduced modern healthcare practices and literacy programs. However, missionary work was deeply intertwined with colonial power, not just altruism. Conversion to Christianity was encouraged, sometimes aggressively, which created tensions with traditional Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and tribal belief systems. For many Indians, conversion offered access to education and social mobility, otherwise restricted by caste hierarchies and colonial discrimination. For others, it was perceived as cultural intrusion or threat. Missionaries also played a role in social reform movements, advocating against practices like sati or child marriage. These campaigns sometimes aligned princes' and reformers' goals, yet also challenged indigenous cultural autonomy. The spread of Christianity reconfigured religious dynamics and contributed to new forms of identity and community. Whether seen as benevolent or disruptive, missionary activity under British rule did more than spread a religion. It transformed social and cultural landscapes, influencing debates about tradition, modernity, and belonging in Indian society. One of the darkest aspects of British rule in India was its handling of famines, catastrophes that claimed millions of lives. India experienced repeated famines in the 18th and 19th centuries, but under colonial rule, responses were often inadequate or misguided. In cases like the Bengal famine of 1943, millions died of starvation and disease while food exports continued, and relief was limited. Policies steeped in economic orthodoxy, such as laissez-faire attitudes toward grain markets and prioritization of exports over local needs, aggravated food scarcity. Colonial revenue demands forced farmers to grow cash crops like indigo, cotton, or jute instead of food grains, reducing local resilience in times of crisis. Transportation systems like railways, originally introduced for imperial benefit, sometimes facilitated the movement of food out of famine-stricken regions rather than into them. Relief efforts were limited by beliefs that providing free food would disrupt markets or foster dependency. These attitudes reflected a colonial mindset that valued economic efficiency over human life. The repeated famines under British rule were not inevitable climatic disasters. They were shaped and worsened by policies that prioritized colonial profit and structural interests over Indian well-being, leaving deep scars on collective memory. The year 1857 was a watershed moment in Indian history, a moment when simmering discontent erupted into open revolt. What began as isolated mutinies among Indian soldiers, sepoys, in the British East India Company's army quickly spread into widespread rebellion across northern and central India. Causes were many: resentment toward British interference with traditional practices, strict disciplinary codes, racist attitudes in the army, and the destruction of local power structures and economies. A spark came from rumors that rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to Hindus and Muslims alike, igniting broader anger at cultural insensitivity and colonial arrogance. The rebellion, though ultimately suppressed, shocked British rulers. It exposed how deeply Indian aspirations, grievances, and identities had been overlooked or trampled under colonial policies. In response, the British government dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct rule over India through the British Crown. India became a formal colony, a shift from corporate dominion to imperial administration. The rebellion was called the First War of Independence, by Indians and mutiny by the British. But regardless of name, it marked a turning point where colonial rule would become more centralized, more authoritarian, and more attuned, albeit imperfectly, to Indian unrest. With the rebellion of 1857 quelled, the British Crown took direct control of India, ushering in an era known as the British Raj. The title Raj reflects direct governance. India was no longer managed by a trading company, but ruled as a formal colony of the British Empire. A viceroy represented the crown, overseeing administration, law, and policy. British officials dominated key positions, while Indians were often relegated to subordinate roles. This centralized, bureaucratic governance system aimed to prevent another large-scale uprising and to stabilize British authority. The Raj brought sweeping changes: standardized taxation, structured legal systems, rail and telegraph expansion, educational institutions modeled on British systems, and a civil service designed to maintain order. While British officials argued these reforms modernized India, they also entrenched colonial control. Indians had limited political voice, and any dissent was met with strict measures. The Raj era significantly altered Indian society, introducing Western governance structures, reshaping public discourse, and influencing elite education. It was a period when Indian lands, resources, laws, and futures were increasingly influenced, controlled, or dictated by a distant imperial power. The Raj laid the groundwork for both institutional transformation and the eventual rise of Indian nationalism. British rule didn't simply superimpose foreign control. It reinterpreted and reshaped Indian society, especially caste and class structures. Before colonial rule, caste systems were complex social networks rooted in local customs, regionally varied, and tied to religious traditions. But British administrators, seeking to simplify governance, tried to categorize, codify, and rigidify caste identities in official censuses, legal documents, and policy frameworks. What had been fluid community roles became bureaucratic labels. These labels were later used to allocate jobs, quotas, and legal rights under colonial governance, inadvertently freezing caste identities into hardened classifications that persist today. Additionally, British economic changes, particularly the growth of land revenue systems and wage labor, widened class distinctions. Wealth flowed to a small elite who could adapt to colonial systems, while rural peasants and urban workers experienced marginalization. Missionary schools and English education produced an educated class that became intermediaries between the British and Indian society. This created a new Indian elite class, educated, worldly, but also distanced from traditional community roots. The British impact on caste and class was not merely administrative. It reshaped Indian identity, social mobility, and conflict dynamics in ways that echo into contemporary India. As British authority deepened, a powerful reaction took shape: Indian nationalism. What started as scattered dissent in the 19th century grew into organized political resistance by the late 1800s. Indian intellectuals, reformers, lawyers, and students, many educated in British schools, began demanding greater representation, civil rights, and eventually self-rule. The Indian National Congress, Inc., was formed in 1885, initially as a forum for civil dialogue and reform. Leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and later Bal Gangadhar Talek used the INC platform to articulate grievances and demand accountability from colonial authorities. Nationalism was not a monolith. Some advocated moderate reform, while others pushed for direct independence. Still, what united them was the belief that Indians should have a say in their own governance. Nationalist newspapers, journals, and debates spread political awareness across regions, languages, and classes. The Raja's efforts to modernize education and infrastructure inadvertently facilitated the spread of nationalist ideas. Indians began to see themselves not only as subjects of empire, but as citizens with history, destiny, and political aspirations. The rise of nationalism marked the beginning of a long struggle that would eventually culminate in independence. In the early 20th century, Indian nationalism entered a new phase under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance, satyagraha, transformed the struggle for freedom. Gandhi's appeal was universal. He reached not just educated elites, but peasants, workers, and communities across India. He believed in ahimsa, nonviolence, self-sufficiency, and peaceful protest against injustice. Gandhi's movements, like the Non-Cooperation Movement 1920, Salt March 1930, and Quit India Movement 1942, galvanized millions into action. Ordinary Indians participated in boycotts, strikes, and symbolic protests against British laws and taxes. British authorities responded with arrests, repression, and mass detentions, but cannot suppress the spirit of collective resistance. Gandhi's emphasis on unity transcended caste, religion, and class, even as internal tensions existed. His leadership helped internationalize the Indian cause, attracting global attention and increasing moral pressure on Britain. Gandhi's vision was about more than independence. It was about dignity, self-respect, and a new social order rooted in justice. Under his influence, the freedom movement became not just a political campaign, but a moral struggle, one that reshaped Indian society and brought millions into the fold of collective action. The two world wars of the 20th century altered the global balance of power and India's role within it. During World War I, over 1 million Indian soldiers served in British forces, fighting in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. India contributed manpower, money, and material to the imperial war effort, often with little consultation or consent. Indians expected reward in the form of political reform and greater autonomy after the war, but were met with limited concessions and continued colonial control. Disappointment fueled growing resentment. World War II further intensified these dynamics. Without consulting Indian leaders, the British declared India at war, deepening Indian frustration at colonial authority. The war strained Britain's resources, weakened its economic and military position, and galvanized anti-colonial sentiment globally. The devastating Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia also showed that Western domination could be challenged. The aftermath of World War II left Britain economically exhausted and politically weaker, making it increasingly difficult to maintain control over colonies. India's contribution to the war effort and the global push for decolonization created conditions where British withdrawal became both inevitable and urgent. The world wars did not free India by themselves, but they broke the myth of Western invincibility and reshaped global power toward self-determination. After decades of struggle, the dream of freedom finally became reality, but not without tragic cost. In 1947, British rule ended. and India achieved independence. But the subcontinent was partitioned into two nations, India and Pakistan. Partition was driven by religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims and political disagreements over representation and governance. The boundary lines were drawn hastily by British officials and resulted in widespread chaos. Millions of people were forced to flee their homes, crossing newly drawn borders amid violence, looting, and fear. Estimates of deaths vary widely, but hundreds of thousands, and possibly millions, lost their lives in the turmoil. The trauma of partition left deep scars on both sides of the new border and shaped political relationships for decades. Independence freed India from colonial rule, but also revealed deep communal tensions and challenges of nation-building. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, faced the enormous task of uniting millions of citizens across languages, religions, and regions into a democratic republic. The joy of freedom was interwoven with sorrow, loss, and a monumental responsibility to rebuild a fractured land. One of the most profound transformations after British rule was India's embrace of democracy and a written constitution. In 1950, India adopted a constitution that enshrined universal adult suffrage, fundamental rights, and a federal structure that balanced national unity with regional autonomy. The very idea of a democratic republic reflected both a rejection of colonial authoritarianism and an affirmation of Indian agency. British rule had introduced legal systems, civil services, and parliamentary procedures, and independent India transformed those inherited frameworks into tools of representative governance. India's democracy was remarkable in scope. Hundreds of millions of citizens, dozens of languages, and myriad cultural traditions participated in periodic elections. The Constitution's emphasis on equality, social justice, and freedom of expression marked a commitment to dignity and participation for all citizens. It also provided mechanisms for holding leaders accountable, a stark contrast to colonial administration. While challenges like corruption, inequality, and regional tensions persist, India's democratic experiment remains the largest in the world. It continues to evolve, drawing on constitutional ideals rooted in the struggle against colonial rule and the vision of a pluralistic, inclusive nation. British rule left a lasting impact on language and education in India. English, introduced by colonial administrators and missionaries, became a language of governance, law, business, and higher learning. After independence, India chose not to ban English, but to elevate it alongside Hindi and regional languages, creating a multilingual educational and administrative environment. This choice allowed India to engage with global diplomacy, science, and trade while preserving indigenous languages and culture. English became a tool of empowerment for many Indians, opening doors to international education, technology, and global careers. At the same time, regional languages like Bengali, Telugu, Marathi, Tamil, and many others flourished through literature, cinema, and public life, reflecting India's linguistic diversity. Education expanded rapidly after independence, with universities, technical institutes like the Indian Institutes of Technology, IITs, and research centers contributing to technological and economic growth. Colonial education had created a small, educated elite. Post-independence educational reforms democratized access, though disparities remain. The blend of English and indigenous languages symbolizes both colonial legacy and post-colonial adaptation. harnessing global connectivity while nurturing cultural identity. This fusion continues to shape India's role in the world today. While the railways were built by the British for colonial interests, they became one of independent India's most essential infrastructures. After independence, India nationalized and expanded the railway network, connecting remote regions, facilitating economic activity, and fostering national cohesion. Trains became the lifeblood of trade, agriculture, and everyday life, carrying goods, people, and ideas across vast distances. Railways helped integrate regional markets, enabling farmers to access broader consumer bases and businesses to grow beyond local economies. The network also played a crucial role in internal migration, allowing workers to move for jobs and education, knitting together a multicultural society. Roadways, ports, and aviation expanded alongside railways, contributing to India's post-independence urbanization and industrialization. These transportation systems, born in a colonial context, were transformed into tools of nation-building and development. Rather than serving extraction, they began serving inclusion, linking schools to villages, hospitals to communities, and families to opportunities. India used this inherited infrastructure to accelerate modernization, industrial growth, and social mobility. While challenges like congestion, maintenance, and accessibility persist, the transportation legacy of British rule was repurposed to unify rather than divide, becoming a backbone of India's ongoing progress. After independence, India faced the massive challenge of feeding its rapidly growing population. Traditional agriculture struggled to produce enough food, especially after the disruptions of colonial land policies and famines. In the 1960s, India embraced the Green Revolution, a set of agricultural reforms that introduced high-yield crop varieties, modern fertilizers, irrigation systems, and scientific farming techniques. Leaders like S. Swaminathan championed hybrid seeds of wheat and rice that significantly increased production. The impact was transformative. India went from food scarcity and dependency on imports to self-sufficiency and even grain surplus in many regions. Rural economies were reshaped as farmers adopted new methods and technologies. However, the Green Revolution was not without challenges. It favored regions with irrigation, like Punjab and Haryana, leaving dryland areas behind. Increased use of chemical fertilizers raised environmental concerns, including soil degradation and water pollution. Still, in the context of a nation once ravaged by famine and colonial exploitation of agriculture, the Green Revolution represented a powerful turning point, a move toward food security, rural empowerment, and technological advancement that helped India stand on its own feet. In the decades following independence, India embarked on a path of planned economic development. Inspired by socialist ideas and the urgent need to build industry, the government initiated 5-year plans aimed at promoting heavy industry, infrastructure, and self-reliance. Steel mills, power plants, textile factories, and mining sectors were established, often with state ownership and central planning. Industrial cities like Jamshedpur, Bhilai, and Rourkela became symbols of India's industrial ambition. The idea was not merely economic growth, but economic sovereignty, reducing dependence on imports and breaking the colonial legacy of raw material export dependence. While industrialization created jobs and technological capacity, it also posed challenges: bureaucratic red tape, license permit Raj restrictions, and uneven regional development slowed progress. Private entrepreneurship survived but navigated complex regulations. By the 1980s, India began realizing that its mixed economic model needed reform. That realization set the stage for economic liberalization in the 1990s, which opened doors for private investment, global integration, and rapid growth. The economic journey from post-colonial planning to market reforms reflects India's effort to overcome colonial economic patterns and chart its own development path, balancing state intervention with private dynamism. British rule inadvertently ignited social reform movements across Indian society. Reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, and Jyotirao Phule challenged entrenched social practices, including sati, widow immolation, child marriage, and caste discrimination. While these reformers were influenced by Western education and humanitarian thought introduced during the colonial period, many grounded their arguments in indigenous philosophies of justice and equality as well. The colonial legal framework, despite its biases, provided a platform to outlaw some regressive practices and to advocate for rights-based reform. Later reformers, such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, campaigned for the rights of the historically oppressed Dalits, critiquing both social hierarchy and state neglect. Women's reform movements pressed for greater access to education and legal rights, contributing to the early constitutional emphasis on equality. These movements were not only reactions to colonialism, but also indigenous efforts to modernize society, blending Indian values with global ideas of human dignity. While colonial interference often had coercive elements, it also helped catalyze conversations about human rights and social justice, dialogues that would shape India's constitutional ethos after independence. British rule did more than transform India's politics and economy. It stimulated a profound cultural awakening that reshaped national identity. Confronted with Western education and historical scholarship, Indian intellectuals began rediscovering ancient texts, philosophies, and artistic traditions. Scholars like Swami Vivekananda emphasized the spiritual and philosophical depth of Indian heritage, inspiring pride in indigenous culture. Literary figures, poets, and dramatists revived classical languages while also experimenting with new forms of expression in Urdu, Hindi, Bengali, and regional languages. Indian art and music found renewed significance as symbols of identity. This cultural revival was not romantic nostalgia. It was dynamic reinterpretation. Indian thinkers used history, language, and tradition to forge a narrative of dignity, resilience, and unity in the face of colonial domination. This cultural renaissance fed directly into the independence movement, giving it emotional resonance beyond politics. Rather than rejecting all that was Indian, nationalists reclaimed it as a foundation for a modern, pluralistic identity. In this sense, British influence paradoxically accelerated India's self-recognition, creating space for renewed pride in cultural roots while reshaping traditions for a changing world. During the colonial era, women's roles in Indian society underwent significant transformation. While patriarchal structures remained robust, the introduction of Western education and legal reform opened doors for women's participation in public life. Early pioneers like Rani Lakshmibai, who fought bravely in the 1857 rebellion, became symbols of resistance. Social reformers, including Begums of Bhopal and figures like Annie Besant, advocated for women's rights, education, and social equality. Access to formal education expanded with mission schools and later government-supported institutions, enabling women to enter fields previously restricted. Indian women played critical roles in the independence movement, from Sarojini Naidu's leadership in protests and boycotts to Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit's diplomatic contributions later. Reformers also tackled oppressive social practices, campaigning against child marriage and for widow rights. These movements did not simply mimic Western feminism. They were rooted in local struggles for justice, dignity, and equality. Post-independence constitutions guaranteed equal rights, reflecting struggles that began under colonial influence. Though gender inequality persists, the colonial period set in motion a long conversation about women's roles, rights, and potential, a legacy that continues to evolve in contemporary India. British administration's systematic categorization of Indian society inadvertently crystallized caste identities in ways that had both detrimental and transformative outcomes. Colonial censuses, legal codes, and administrative divisions fixed fluid community networks into rigid categories. While this codification often reinforced social stratification, it also made caste inequities more visible and easier to challenge. In the 20th century, leaders like B.R. Ambedkar, himself born into a Dalit community, fought to secure constitutional protections and political representation for historically marginalized groups. India's post-independence government adopted reservation policies, affirmative action in education, employment, and political representation aimed at correcting centuries of oppression rooted in caste hierarchy. These policies sought to broaden access, empower disadvantaged communities, and promote social justice. While debates about the effectiveness and fairness of reservation continue, the underlying goal remains reducing caste-based inequality. The colonial legacy of categorization gave modern reformers a framework to identify inequities, even as it entrenched stereotypes that reformers had to dismantle. In this way, British policies indirectly shaped India's post-colonial social reform agenda, compelling Indian leaders to confront caste inequalities head-on and embed protections within the constitutional framework. One of the most tragic consequences of colonial rule was the rise of communal tensions, particularly between Hindu and Muslim communities, which culminated in the partition of India in 1947. British policy sometimes exploited religious divisions as a strategy of divide and rule, encouraging separate electorates, communal representation, and political mobilization along religious lines. This aggravated differences that had previously coexisted in many regions under shared cultural life. Political leaders, including the All India Muslim League, called for separate political space for Muslims, while others demanded a unified India. As independence approached, tensions escalated and negotiations over borders intensified. The hurried drawing of boundaries by the British drew arbitrary lines between India and Pakistan, triggering one of the largest mass migrations in human history. Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs crossed borders amid astonishing violence, riots, and upheaval. Estimates of deaths vary but range in the hundreds of thousands, while millions were displaced. Families were uprooted, properties lost, and entire communities traumatized. The violence of partition left deep scars on collective memory, and shaped India's political trajectory for decades. Communalism, exacerbated by colonial policy and politics, became a persistent challenge that India continues to navigate. After independence, India faced the immense task of rebuilding a nation fractured by colonialism, class division, and communal violence. In response, its leaders enshrined secularism and pluralism as key pillars of the republic. The Indian Constitution guarantees freedom of religion, equal rights, and the separation of state and religion, a way of ensuring that no single community would dominate public life. This commitment was in part a response to the communal tensions and violence surrounding partition. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru emphasized unity and diversity, championing an India where multiple languages, faiths, and cultures could coexist within shared democratic values. Religious tolerance became a constitutional ideal, even if real-world tensions occasionally challenged it. India's pluralism today is visible in its festivals, languages, arts, and public spaces, where Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Buddhist, and other traditions contribute to cultural vitality. This pluralistic ethos stands in contrast to the colonial past, where religious divisions were sometimes manipulated for political ends. India's journey toward inclusive democracy demonstrates the strength of constitutional protections and the ongoing effort to uphold coexistence in a diverse society. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, India embraced economic liberalization, technologies, and globalization to revive and transform its economy. After decades of planned development, the government initiated reforms in the 1990s that opened markets, encouraged private enterprise, and invited foreign investment. India's youthful workforce became a global asset, particularly in technology sectors. Cities like Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Pune became hubs of software development and innovation. English language proficiency, a colonial legacy, gave Indian professionals an advantage in global communication, services, and tech industries. India entered the information age with remarkable growth in IT, telecommunications, and engineering services. From call centers to cutting-edge research labs, Indian talent became sought after internationally. Growth lifted millions out of poverty, expanded the middle class, and reshaped consumer culture. Challenges remain inequality, infrastructure needs, and rural development, but India's economic trajectory highlights its adaptability and resilience. The nation that once endured colonial extraction of wealth now contributes to global knowledge, trade, and innovation. This economic transformation shows not just growth, but India's capacity to redefine inherited structures toward its own modernization. British rule changed India in profound and lasting ways on railways, legal systems, language, governance, and identity. Some transformations brought hardship, exploitation, and division. Others planted seeds of reform, modernization, and unity that post-colonial India nurtured and embraced. India's journey from colony to republic wasn't linear or simple. It was filled with struggle, resistance, adaptation, and resilience. Today's India, a democratic powerhouse with immense cultural, economic, and technological presence, carries both the scars and the strengths of its colonial past. Structures like the Constitution, the civil service, English language networks, and infrastructure bear colonial imprints, but India has made them its own, reshaping them to serve its people and ambitions. While colonial rule extracted wealth and imposed authority, it also inadvertently catalyzed ideas of self-determination, nationalism, and reform. India's ability to transform inherited systems into tools of empowerment is a testament to its dynamism. The story of British rule in India is not only about domination and resistance, but about continuity and reinvention, where a nation forged its own identity out of centuries of encounter, conflict, and change.